Good afternoon. I'm Homi Bhabha. I direct the Mahindra Humanities Center here, and I'm delighted to welcome you to a extraordinarily, for me, special event. Dipesh Chakrabarty is a very close friend, and if the term isn't somewhat outdated, I would say he really has been a soul brother for many, many years. This is not a formal introduction. The formal introduction will be given by Professor Emma Rothschild, who's director of the Center for Economics and History and Economics. I might have got that wrong. But it's impossible for me to be formal with Dipesh, or Dipu as I call him. But that does not mean that I have not, through our relations of informality and formality, learned a great deal from him. And I just want to talk about two things very briefly. It's from Dipesh that I learned that one's academic work, as much as one's personal life, should be conducted with a feeling for the ethics of care. Both the understanding of the vulnerability of people or planet, as well as the caring agency of protection, propagation, responsibility, witnessing. Care in both the senses. Care as in being careworn, and care as in bearing and witnessing, protecting, resisting, taking care. And I learned this from him, as I say, both as a matter of life and as a matter of work, and as a matter of careful reading. And for that, I'm deeply grateful. It was through Dipesh's conversations with me that I understood that even as a subaltern, one could be caring about the middle classes. And some of the best discussions we had was the struggle for decency amongst the middle classes in India, something we see in the new Aam Aadmi Party now. This deep sense of caring across the board in moments of vulnerability is extraordinarily important. And I think it actually leads to something else. And although these are my words, the sentiment is Dipesh's. I remember him saying to me a number of times that the aim is not to win the argument, but to be able to join the conversation. Now, this is not exactly how he put it, but the sentiment is his. And I am delighted that he's here with us today so that we can join in conversation with him. And I very much hope that we will have many more opportunities to do so. Thank you.
On behalf of the Joint Center for History and Economics, the Harvard University Center for the Environment, which is supporting this event, and of course the Humanities Center, it's a tremendous pleasure and honor to welcome Dipesh Chakrabarty. He's one of the leading historians, critics, intellectuals, and thinkers of our time. His work is enormously well known to people here. He rethinking working class history had a huge impact on me, and I'm sure on many others. Provincializing Europe, post-colonial thought and historical difference. He has a major book coming out called The Calling of History, Sir Jadunath Sarkar and His Empire of Truth. He's written extensively about the nature of history and the relationship between history and the present. His biography reveals some, to me, unsuspected, but for today extremely suitable achievements. His first degree was in physics. He then picked up another MBA degree. And in many ways, the work that he's going to be talking about today is profoundly about history and economics and the nature of capital. It draws on his ongoing work on the climate of history. And this work has already profoundly changed the way people think about history. If it were not quite the wrong metaphor, I would say it's had an electrifying effect on how many of us think about history. It's actually not a surprise that such a wide extent of this university should be part of inviting Dipesh to be here. The Centre for the Environment, with its deep roots in earth sciences and geology, social sciences, history and economics, the Humanities Centre. And I hope and expect that we will be inspired by Dipesh to think about what we can do to bring the sort of thought he's engaged in to our own home disciplines. So, warm welcome, Dipesh. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Homi. Thank you, Emma, both for this very warm welcome and also to Emma for the invitation to come and speak. I think Homi is right in communicating our shared sentiment that arguments are not there to be won, but to be joined as forms of conversation. But since I was coming to Harvard, I thought, in deference to and out of respect from a very well-known Harvard personality, I should try and be an example of the argumentative Indian on this occasion. So I will begin on a polemical note. I hope a civil and gentle polemical note. After I published my first essay on the climate problem, looking at it from a historian's point of view, the Climate of History 4 thesis, the critic and theorist Slavoj Zizek criticized me in his book, Living in the End Times. And the criticism was interesting to me, and I'll start with his criticism and try to answer his criticism in my talk. Some of his criticisms concern points about the true nature of Hegelian dialectic, which I will not discuss today. But he also made a point about the relationship between anthropogenic climate change and the capitalist mode of production. That provides me with a starting point for this talk. So, responding to my proposition that we needed to think deep history of the species and the much shorter history of capital together, responding to this proposition, Zizek wrote that since, and I'm quoting, the fate of the whole with the WH, by which he, within brackets, he says life on earth, since the fate of life on earth, the whole, hinges on what goes on in what was formerly one of its parts, that is capitalism. We also have to accept the paradox that the key struggle is the particular one. One can solve the universal problem of the survival of the human species only by first resolving the particular deadlock of the capitalist mode of production. So you have to resolve the problems of capitalism because that is the only way you can address the climate question. The key, as he says, to the ecological crisis does not reside in ecology as such. It resides in capital. I get versions of these criticisms in other forms, particularly in France, but elsewhere too, that I don't give enough, make enough room for capitalism, or that I don't make enough room for questions of justice between nations and human beings. So I'll return to those criticisms. Now, I have no quarrels to pick with the proposition that capitalism acts as a proximate, whatever we call capitalism, acts as a proximate cause or an efficient cause for the emission of greenhouse gases that warms up the atmosphere and the oceans as well. But I do think that to understand the climate crisis only as an accentuation of the problem of capitalism, the deadlock of the capitalist mode of production, is to misunderstand the present historical moment we inhabit. In other words, it is to see the present only as a phase of capitalism, and to miss out, I think, on the very particular ways in which the popularization of the science of anthropogenic climate change forces on us, the popularization of the science forces on us, and us meaning commentators, critics, and other interested members of the reading public in the humanities and in the interpretive social sciences, the way in which that science forces on us an emergent form of consciousness, an emergent mode of thinking that I will here describe as planetary. And what I want to make a distinction, propose a distinction between is what I could call global forms of thinking and what I'm calling emergent planetary forms of thinking. They're connected, but just for the sake of clarity of exposition, I would want to make this distinction. If you look at the literature on globalization and the popular literature on global warming date from the same period, early 1990s, even though we, in the human sciences, we're all doing globalization, and we're not really doing climate change or global warming until the fourth report of the IPCC came out, and the issue became popular, which was after 2007. But if you go to a library and look at the shelves on popular science on global warming, you'll find the date from the same period, roughly. The globalization literature has developed very interesting distinctions between what they call worldwide and global. Henri Lefebvre's work actually has been very interesting in developing that distinction. But broadly speaking, in the globalization literature, when the word planetary has been used, it has actually meant the globe. If you go through, I mean, just to take a text at random, for instance, Carl Schmitt's book on the nomos of the Earth, and he uses the word planetary many times in that book. So even in the 50s, thinking about the world that Europeans made, which was actually, in Joyce Chaplin's terms, the movement towards making human world global. Eventually, a movement towards seeing us as living on a planet that is global in its shape. It's like a globe. You will find there are many instances where he uses the word planetary to mean global. Just to give you one example at random, from Schmitt, I'm just reading out a couple of sentences. The first attempts in international law to divide the Earth as a whole, according to the new global concept of geography, began immediately after 1492. These were also the first adaptations of the new planetary image of the world. The English island at the time of the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 remained a part of the European planetary order. So in some ways, if I think of as a historian, or the literature of how we had thought the planetary in both during the phase of globalization as well as in the phase of studying globalization, I kind of, in my head, bookend that literature with two publications. One is, of course, Joyce Chaplin's book, his recent book on the history of circumnavigation of the planet, whereby the planet is experienced by us as global. And an interesting article that came out in the American Historical Review before Joyce's book by a young historian called Ben Lazier, looking at the famous photo of the Earthrise that was taken from a spaceship, where what you have is kind of humans looking in, looking towards the Earth from outside and finding that the planet is global, and that's where we all live. I want to sort of say that if that's how the planet is thought about, the word global in that sense is fundamentally not only a humanistic concept, but it's a concept that necessarily involves human beings. So to think about the planet in the mode of thinking that attends globalization as a problem, the planetary is something that refers back to humans on the planet. It's our planet. We, through the expansion of Europe, through the expansion of trade, through empires, through colonies, increasingly through interconnections, have made our lives global. And in that sense, it's a concept that deeply implicates the human in it. If you look at the idea of the planet in the climate science, it's interesting that what you begin to get is what you might call interplanetary consciousness. In other words, in climate science, this planet is one planet amongst many. And you literally see this in the careers of climate science, some of the well-known climate scientists. So in a way, climate science, the idea of the planet in the literature on climate science drives a wedge between the planetary of globalization literature and the expression planetary on the climate science side. For even though the current phase of the warming of this planet is considered to be anthropogenic by climate scientists, this is only contingently so. Humans have no intrinsic role to play in the science of planetary warming as such. In fact, one of the books that is taught as a textbook in Chicago Geophysics, and I assume elsewhere, published by Cambridge by one of my colleagues, Ray Humbert, where people do mathematical exercise on warming of planets. It's actually called planetary science. So that the idea of a planet warming up is not necessarily or exclusively related to this planet as such. And therefore, the science is not even specific to Earth. It is part of what might be called planetary science, what is called planetary science, and therefore it does not belong to an Earth-bound imagination. So our current warming is an instance of planetary warming, and it's a phenomenon, but warming is a phenomenon that can be seen and has been seen in the case of other planets too. So if you look at the careers of two well-known concerned climate scientists and another person who is a chemist who has involved himself in the question of climate crisis, and I'm thinking of the American James Hansen, the NASA scientist, and the English chemist James Lovelock, you will find that they both became interested in the question of anthropogenic global warming by beginning to study warming on other planets. So Hansen used to study warming of Venus. Lovelock, during a visiting appointment at NASA, when he was actually studying Mars, became interested in the question of that, eventually became the Gaia question. And so the other problem where you see it very clearly that the planetary, what I'm calling planetary awareness, is not necessarily tied to this planet, is a question that comes up in climate literature all the time, but it's actually a question that was there before global warming happened. In the literature, like in books on Pierre Humbert's book on planetary science, it's called the habitability problem. And the habitability problem asks, why is this planet habitable while other planets are not? This is the question at the heart of Lovelock's idea of Gaia. It's a question that is central to a book written by an English geologist and his colleague, Jan Zalasiewicz, called The Goldilocks Planet, which is actually again trying to explain this question, why this planet is habitable. So the implicit question is that why are other planets not habitable? And therefore you can see that you're thinking planets comparatively. And that's why I'm saying that even the planetary consciousness is actually interplanetary consciousness. That's the beginning of it. That's where we come to the question of climate science. And in that sense, I would say, the use of the word planetary is somewhat different from the use of the word planetary in the globalization literature. In other words, the planet is thought about in different ways. I mean, when Carl Schmitt writes about planetary, there's no other planet in view. This is the planet he's talking about. And that happens and the other point I want to make also in the beginning polemically is that the climate crisis is not a crisis that could have been foreseen within the problematic of globalization. I mean, the problematic of globalization raises other problems of injustice, multiculturalism, capitalism, its inequalities, neoliberalism, all of those questions. The climate crisis does not come even out of old environmental problems. You know, sometimes in environmental literature, you will find what they call Kuznets curve, you know, whereby you pollute in the course of industrialization and then develop the capacity to take care of the pollution. The climate crisis defies those sorts of propositions. It actually comes from this other, much bigger question about the universe. And the climate crisis brings into view the collision or the running up against one another of three histories that, from the point of view of human history, are formally assumed, or have been so far formally assumed, to work at such different and distinct paces that they're treated as processes separate from one another for all practical purposes. And the three histories that the crisis bring together, the history of the Earth system, which is something you have to know in order to understand what the nature of the crisis is, the history of life, including that of human evolution on the planet, the species question, and the more recent history of industrial civilization. Humans now unintentionally straddle these three histories that operate on different scales and speeds. What this means is that, contrary to what Zizek is saying in criticism of my proposition, our understanding of this crisis does not lend itself easily to politics, precisely because it kind of traverses all these multiple scales. So the very language with which we speak of climate crisis is also shot through with the problem of human and inhuman scales of time. Take the most ubiquitous distinction we make in our everyday life or everyday prose between non-renewable sources of energy and the renewables. Fossil fuels we consider non-renewable on our terms. So when you talk about solar or wind, we think fossil is non-renewable. But as the British geologist Brian Lovell, who has also acted as an advisor to BP and other oil companies, point out, not usefully, where he says that fossil fuels are indeed renewable, if only we think of them on a scale that is inhuman. So to read his sentence, he says, 200 million years from now, a form of life requiring abundant oil for some purpose should find that plenty has formed since our times. So you can see that even in the distinction, what is thinking of scale. So paleoclimatologists tell a very long history when it comes to explaining the significance of anthropogenic global warming. There is, first of all, the question of evidence. So you can't even, what I'm saying is that both the justice arguments, some forms of justice arguments, some forms of capitalist arguments want to contain this story, fold it back into the history of the last 500 years. Whereas if you look at the definition of the problem, the very evidence on which it's based, different kinds of evidence, raises questions of many hundreds of thousands of years. The ice core samples that have been critical to establishing the problem of climate change more than 800,000 years old. There are, besides paleoclimatic records of the past in fossil and other geological materials, and again in Brian Lovell's book, but geologists normally talk about a dramatic warming event, which they actually go back to kind of foresee the sort of problems that could happen from very radical warming, which is called the PETM, the event, which took place, the Paleocene thermal maximum, which took place 55 million years ago, long before they were human beings. But when the temperature went up by 7-8 degrees over 10,000 years. But they kind of go to that archive to show what happened to life when temperature went up by that and carbon dioxide went up, to draw conclusions about what might happen now and point out that the point that some of the sense of crisis comes about from the fact that temperatures are going up over at a much faster rate. So what went up, we're not sort of putting our temperature up over another 10,000 years. We're doing it over decades and centuries at most. So how far the arc of the geological history explaining the present climate crisis projects? I'm just saying this partly to give you a sense of the scale argument that I'm going to mount soon. So how far the arc projects is seen from the title of a book by another colleague of mine in the geophysics division, David Archer's book, The Long Thaw, the subtitle of which says how humans are changing the next 100,000 years of Earth's climate. And where he basically says that mankind has become a force in climate comparable to the orbital variations that drive glacial cycles. So I won't go into the details of his argument here, but simply to say that they're all agreed that eventually, if we did nothing about the climate problem, there are processes in the carbon cycle of the Earth where actually the planet will clean up our mess, but again over a very inhuman time scale. So therefore, to go back to Homi's very generous introduction, the sense of crisis actually comes from a sense of caring. If one didn't care about industrial civilization, if one didn't care about the values we really value in our way of life, we wouldn't have a sense of crisis. And therefore, and that's one reason why the scientists have tried to popularize the science. So what I'm saying is that, drawing a very sort of rough and ready distinction between knowledge and what I was calling consciousness of thought, which is that all of the climate science remained, of course, as knowledge. And as knowledge has changed, there were theories of global cooling, then there were theories of global warming. But the knowledge now is becoming popularized thanks to the scientists. And the scientists are popularizing it because they have a sense of crisis. That sense of crisis doesn't come from the science itself. It comes out from their citizenly involvement in our collective life, or their human involvement in our collective life. So somewhere there is a question of care, which actually defines a scientific problem as a crisis. And therefore, and it's only because it's defined as a crisis and they're popularizing their own researches that I'm talking about what was once knowledge becoming a general mode of consciousness. Just as in globalization literature, you could say that the Earth was spherical, that you could go around the Earth. There was a scientific version of that knowledge. But by the late 20th century, it was part of the experience of many human beings in going around it, from flying, from other kinds of experiences. Similarly, there's a deeply humanist question in all this, which I'll return to at the end of my talk, which is the question of caring, which is where the question of crisis is. So the climate crisis thus produces problems. We ponder on very different and incompatible scales of time. Policy specialists think in terms of years, decades, at most centuries, while politicians in democracies think in terms of their electoral cycles. Understanding what anthropogenic climate change is and how long its effects might last calls for thinking on very large scales, scales that defy the usual measures of time that inform normal human affairs. David Archer goes to the heart of the problem here when he acknowledges that the million-year time scale of one of the carbon cycles of the planet the larger cycle, he says, is irrelevant for political considerations of climate change on human timescales. Yet he insists that it remains relevant to any understanding of anthropogenic climate change, since, he says, ultimately global warming will last for as long as it takes for these slow processes to work out. So significant gaps between cognition and action, between being intellectually able to foresee a problem and being able to act on it, thus opens up in the existing literature on climate problem gaps between what we scientifically know about it and how we think about it when we treat it as a problem to be handled by the very human means at our disposal. These latter means have been developed for addressing problems we face on familiar scales of time. I call these gaps or openings in the landscape of our thoughts about climate rifts, because they are like fault lines on a seemingly continuous surface. We have to keep crossing or straddling them as we think of climate change. They inject a certain degree of contradictoriness in our thinking, for we are being asked to think on different scales at once. So in the end, as I said, we both, in the end, thinking climate, we both think the global planetary, the global being a very human invested category. The human is always present in the idea of the global. And the planetary, the planet of James Hansen's or James Lovelock's, which actually is not a human invested concept to begin with. You know, it's their care that brings that into the fold of public discussion. So I want to discuss three such rifts. One is, now I forgot to bring my stick. I thought I'd just name those rifts on some sort of screen to help you remember, and also having something on a screen, in my experience, helps when your mind is on a flight behavior. You can just stop listening. And then when I forgot it, I thought the room would have windows. Unfortunately, it doesn't. So just be on a flight behavior when you want to. But let me just name the three rifts I want to talk about. The first rift I want to talk about, that I see in the literature, is between the various regimes of probability that govern our everyday lives in modern economies. These regimes having to be supplemented in our thinking by the knowledge of the potential radical uncertainty of the climate system. So probability versus some kind of radical uncertainty which cannot be brought within probabilistic thinking is the first rift I want to talk about. The second rift really turns around the story of our necessarily divided human lives, where we argue between us, amongst ourselves, about justice, about other things. The rift between that having to be then supplemented in our thinking by a story of our participation as a dominant species in the history of life of on the planet. And in other words, the story of our participation as a species in the history of life on this planet, irrespective of what divides us. And the third rift is really having to wrestle with our inevitably anthropocentric thinking in order to supplement it with forms of disposition towards the planet that do not put humans first. And I'm not saying we can overcome these rifts. I'm really presenting them as something that almost, in old post-colonial terms, gives us a new form of double consciousness. So let me go to probability and the radical. Okay, I'll have to edit a lot of it out in the interest of time. So it's 1:45. So I'll probably speak for another half an hour, and I can't compress it any more than that. So I'll kind of put my points bluntly and quickly. So probability versus radical uncertainty. So it's simple, which is that our modern life in industrial civilization is ruled by regimes of probability, from probabilistic thinking, from evaluating lives for actuarial purposes to working of money and stock markets. We manage our societies by calculating risks and assigning probability values to them. And I discuss some of the economics literature on climate change in this section, and I'll just simply tell you what my proposition is. The proposition is that when you look at the risk literature on climate science, with the sole exception of one Harvard economist, Martin Weitzman, whom I've read, and to the degree that I understand the economics propositions, there's an assumption that because we know the relationship broadly between greenhouse gas emissions, the quantity of greenhouse gas emissions, and the nature of the rise of temperature, that somehow the risk of the rise of temperature, the risk that follows from it, can be calculated. And we can therefore make investments now to take care of those risks. Then there are sort of divisions about the discounting rate and how much we should invest now, how much we should invest later. All those discussions are there. But that's fundamentally what economists are doing. So now I'm talking about market, Zizek is not a market-friendly person. Now I'm talking about market-friendly person. So interestingly, it's like people who don't like capitalism say, let's work on capitalism first to fix the problem. And people who love capitalism also say, let's work through capitalism to fix the problem. So I'm now talking about people who love capitalism or love the market. And there the proposition is that this is a risk. Interestingly, when you read climate scientists, it's very clear. So, risk is basically, the idea of risk is, and risk is an uncertainty that you can quantify. So if you can't quantify it, there's a certain kind of uncertainty, which is not risk, which is something else. And in the climate literature, this figure of this radical uncertainty moves around the whole question of tipping point. So the tipping point is when the warming goes to a certain point, let's say 4 degrees Celsius, and other positive feedback loops come into play and make that 4 degrees, 6 degrees, 7 degrees, 8 degrees, and you have runaway global warming. The way in which now, if you read the literature, you'll find that the reason why you can't model for a tipping point is that it's a very complex process. Some of it is stochastic, some of it probably can be modeled for, but some of it's like a chaotic process, like a complex chaotic process, so you can't actually model for it. On the other hand, because climate scientists, some of them work, but particularly paleoclimatologists, work as historians do. Basically, the history of the planet is their archive. The history of other planets is their archive, and they go to it. So they actually think of tipping point as a perfectly repeatable phenomenon, even though you can't model for it. And when you read climate scientists, what's very interesting at that point is their metaphors become completely vitalist. And the best example is in a book by Wallace Broker, the climate scientist and the ocean scientist from Columbia University, where he actually says climate is like a beast. And you keep kicking it, and it kicks back at a certain point. Now, you don't know when the beast will kick back. So what happens is that in the risk literature, the ultimate position is what's called the precautionary principle, the maximum principle. So if you think of an outcome as low probability but high, the damage is high, that's a kind of risk insurance you have. But I'm saying this tipping point is a particular problem of uncertainty, which is not a risk proposition. And even in the climate scientists, the example is historical. So, so just to finish off on this, the first drift I've been talking about. So the first drift I speak of organizes itself around the question of the tipping point of the climate, a point beyond which global warming that could be catastrophic for humans. So that such a point exists is not in doubt. And let me just quickly end this by saying, so the only economist who actually takes a very radical position on this, when one of his pieces is Martin Weitzman from this university, where he says in one of his essays that if the truth is that economists can't make policy about the climate crisis, then so be it, and we should accept it. But that's not a general position that economists would normally take. So the tipping point and the probability regimes are my first rift in terms of scales, because the tipping point question arises from deep sort of paleontological, climatological evidence. My second proposition is about what I call our divided lives as humans and our life as a collective shared life as a dominant species. Again, I'll have to rush through the propositions. I can come back to the details later in discussion. So think of and here I come into the justice question, which divides us. Now, the fundamental point about the justice question, which has been made by many people now, some economists and some political economists too, is that it comes from, it's a legitimate question, it comes from the fact that if there are 150 or so many nations in the world, 90% of the emissions come from about 12 or 14 nations, India and China being part of it. If you look at humanity as a whole, then most of the emissions are produced by 1/5 of humanity. And the reason is that the poor don't emit very much. So the justice question comes from this proposition that if a minority are having the benefits of emissions, but a majority are going to suffer the consequences, why shouldn't there be justice in the process of mitigation of the problem? Now, I'll come to the justice question soon, but let me say kind of in brackets as is were. Again, if you think about the climate problem, our climate problem today, anthropogenic climate change, is historically an injustice problem. It has, historically, the way it has happened, there has been injustice in it. But actually it's not necessarily logically, inherently a justice question. And that's another reason why it's not it doesn't fall into the basket of environmental problems. I'll tell you why. So if you do a mental thought experiment of imagining yourself back in 1917, the Bolshevik revolution has happened, and Stalin has lost to Trotsky. And there's been a global socialist revolution, unlike Stalin's socialism is one country. And the world has, let's assume, same amount of people, wonderfully distributed prosperity, it's much more egalitarian, but the basis of that prosperity is the use of fossil fuel. The climate crisis would be worse, because together we would have put out even more greenhouse gases than we've done. The fact that we've not put out more greenhouse gases than we've already done is because most people are poor. So what I'm saying is it's logically not a intrahuman justice question, but historically it has been. So the justice people emphasize the historical aspect of it and therefore tell a story of imperialism. The first two people who put forward the justice argument were two Indian environmentalists, Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan, the late Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan, who wrote a little booklet called, the subtitle was about global warming, 1991, and the subtitle was A Case of Environmental Colonialism. But though that pamphlet was the first place where the argument was made that in order to achieve justice, you have to calculate emissions per capita. And this became accepted in the Kyoto Protocol, and therefore sometimes, in fact, out of guilt, out of sense of justice, it's been accepted in Western countries. And many people will say, Australia, for instance, will always say our per capita emissions are so much more than other people who should do something, and they should do something. I mean, they have a terrible government that wants to do nothing and actually is regressive. But again, I'm talking about scales of different histories. It's really what kind of simultaneously avows and disavows the particular feature of human history that connects histories on different scales in the question of per capita is the question of population. I mean, so the per capita helps. In fact, when there have been revisionist thinking with Inside India, in 2009, the Indian Environment Minister, who's not the Environment Minister now, Jairam Ramesh, actually made a statement in the Parliament where he said, look, you're going on about per capita, but if we had been able to solve our population problem, we wouldn't have been able to put forward this per capita argument. So we're making a virtue of one of our failures. He said if you'd also been economically developed, we wouldn't have had the advantage of making this problem. But that's not my point. My point is not polemical. I'm simply saying if you look at the population question, then three things come up from the literature. One is the question of increase of population. Clearly a phenomenon of post-industrialization, post-50s, and has something to do, even the sheer increase of population, I'm not talking about poverty, has something to do with fossil fuel in artificial fertilizers and in the provision of power for irrigation, for artificial irrigation. If you think of the distribution of population, which will actually play a role in how the climate crisis plays out, there's a very interesting observation in much of the literature, which is this, that whenever the geologists look at past cases of global warming on this planet, species survive and have survived previous cases of global warming by migrating. Migrating is a natural mode of responding to global warming. You go to more inhabitable climes. What is the problem now? Both other non-human species and human beings who want to move away from their habitable zones will find that it's very hard to move because there are other humans standing in the way. Because we are everywhere. Now, when you look at, ask the question, when did human beings go everywhere? That process was completed long before capitalism, long before industrialization. So the last part of the world that was to be occupied were the Pacific Islands. And that happened some 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. So that's the other question in which even the poor today participate in the history of the species. The third point, which has been made recently by a geologist from Duke University, Peter Haff, in an interesting, suggestive, intriguing, somewhat controversial essay that was published in a Royal Society journal from Britain, where he argues what he calls the technosphere. In other words, he argues that the reason why we're able to support 7 billion, in future 10 billion human beings on the planet is because of all the connections that modern technology has made, not just the World Wide Web, but shipping, all kinds of connections. And he said if you today took away these connections, human population would collapse to 10 to 12 million on the planet. So he argues that the very fact that we value human lives, the very fact that we're not proposing that human beings die from climate change, even though some unfortunately will, what enables so many of us to actually exist on the planet is the technology we have produced. So in a way, he has an argument, which is not a geologist argument, that we are not sovereigns of the technosphere because we are so dependent on the technosphere to actually keep us alive. So in a sense, however you go, he has an argument that the technosphere has a problem of not being able to recycle its waste, which is CO2, and therefore the technosphere will actually need more energy, not less, in order to have recycling mechanisms within it. But I'm simply giving these examples to say that what conjoins much larger scale histories with more immediate histories of capitalism in the justice issue is population. And so while we will fight, there's a wonderful essay that Edward Wilson has in his book on social creatures, on creatures that are called that he calls eusocial creatures, creatures that form societies. And he says that any creature that forms societies, including us, but also ants and bees and wasps, he says that one of the critical characteristics of eusocial creatures is the tendency to defend the nest. In other words, social creatures fight amongst themselves because their primary solidarity is not to the entirety of the species, their primary solidarity. And then you can come to it through sort of selfish gene type of arguments, kinship selection arguments, but he doesn't go into there. But I'm simply saying, I'm not saying that if there are evolutionary biological reasons why we will fight, but there's an interesting argument as to why human beings will fight. But this argument, at least the point about our being divided is that it's very clear from the literature that even though we call it anthropogenic global warming, the expression anthropogenic or human-induced global warming, the expression human, comes under the most extreme suspicion in the discussion of justice, right? Because you say, why is it humanity? It's really how humanity breaks up and where you apportion blame. But at the same time, I'm saying that the justice issue, which takes the form of per capita calculation, indirectly raises the question of population. And I'm saying in population history, we find a history of human beings which connects both long-term developments and short-term post-industrial developments. My third drift is this. I'm just, as you can see, I'm skipping over, is really around this question, are humans special? The moral dilemma of the Anthropocene. So the Oxford moral philosopher John Broome, who actually worked on this problem of, actually was one of the writers of the climate change report of 2007, and has a very interesting book called Ethics for a Warming Planet, raises this question. Before I raise this question, I should also say that, because people have come up with the word Anthropocene, not a formal word yet, but becoming popular, there's a paper written by the historian John McNeill and some climate people, Paul Crutzen included, who are trying to date this question, trying to give the answer to the question as to from when did Anthropocene begin. And they at least argue that the Anthropocene, this human-induced climate change, the emissions curve, it shows a huge leap, a really exponential growth from the 50s on. Because that's the time when they say, if you look at it, that's the time when other things grow exponentially, like global figures for population, real GDPs, foreign direct investment, damming of rivers, water use, fertilizer consumption, urban population, paper consumption, transport motor vehicle, telephones, international tourism, and McDonald's restaurants. And they say this is when it really has a more recent kick. Interesting thing I should notice is, of course, if you think of this period, and this comes back to this whole question of who is Anthropocene good for, for whom is fossil fuel good, this is exactly the period of two kinds of developments, both in the West and in the non-West. In the non-West, this is the period of decolonization and the period of building dams, which eventually one day will lead to neoliberal economies. And you can't write the history of this period as a human historian completely ignoring that global consumerism also addresses certain questions of justice or inequalities of consumption. So if I think about the kind of pride that an ordinary Indian takes in his smartphone or iPhone or a cheap substitute, this is part of what they're calling the beginning of Anthropocene. And this is also the period in the West when consumer durables become household commodities. So the washing machine, the refrigerator are all introduced in this period. And actually, if you go back and look at the advertisement, they're actually advertised as contributing to women's freedom. So in a way, we're in this point where you ask, okay, so was Anthropocene bad for us? Didn't it also help freedom? And John Broome asked this question. He says, look, ultimately, it must raise this question as to who is this thing good for, nature good for. And he said, I can't answer that question absolutely. He said, there's an absolute question to be asked in moral philosophy, what is nature good for? But he says, I'll tell you this, that nature is good when it's good for human beings. And therefore, we need to, even the argument for sustaining nature is because it's good for us. So that actually raises this question that, are we special? On what, in a funny way, when you read this argument that on what grounds do we base our almost exclusive claims to nature? And I say the word exclusive because Vaclav Smil and other scholars actually have shown how human beings are now consuming most of the biosphere of the planet. We consume almost 90% of what the planet produces. So there is somehow in that right, in that thinking that we have this right to consume thus for our welfare, there's this question that comes up implicitly on what do we base our rights to appropriate at the cost of other species, the maximum, the 90%, 95% of the biosphere, what the biosphere produces. The question is very reminiscent, actually, of a question that Europeans often ask themselves while taking other people's lands, forcibly or otherwise. By what rights do we take other people's land? And you will remember all the debates about Victoria, the Spanish priests, and eventually down to Locke and down to Australia, New Zealand. There's a similar question that comes up. And that then raises this question, do we have this right? And so on the one hand, there's John Broome's type argument that nature is good when it's good for us. And but if you think of this question of human beings being special, it's very clear again, I'm carrying on my polemic with Zizek, that the question is not a modern question. The specialness of human beings has a long history, much before capitalism. And I mean, if one source must be in religions. And as a broad generalization, which we can again go back into, I'll put forward this idea, which I want to more work on, but it's a provisional idea. So I'm happy to receive criticisms. Here is my proposition, that if you look at what are called ancient religions, like African religions, Australian Aboriginal religions that have totemistic sort of features, and think of what Durkheim said about totemism, where he said that in totemistic religions, man is always conceived of as a double, both man and animal. And if you think of those religions where you get the feeling sort of that human beings are not sitting outside of an idiot box watching Animal Planet. In ancient religions, humans are part of the animal planet. They eat animals, animals eat them, getting eaten, being eaten, eating are all part of the deal of life. If you think of what Jaspers once called axial religions, in other words, religions that came into being after the first urban revolution, it seemed to me, religions that thought of a transcendental God, whether in Islam or in Hinduism or in Christianity, also propounded man as having a special place in cosmos. So actually, I find the modern religions much more invested in creating this special place for man. So I'm just simply saying the argument that humans are special and somehow we have a right to what the planet produces is again of a vintage that is much, much older than the history of capitalism. The most radical statement I have read in this context is really in James Lovelock's book, The Vanishing Face of Gaia, where, and whatever you think of Gaia, I mean, it's a contested theory, where he actually has this statement where he says, and it's like the motto of the book, he says, if you want to think of the welfare of the planet, stop putting humans first. But the interesting thing about the sentence is that even that is not as anti-anthropocentric as it sounds. Because in the next sentence he says, if you want to survive, that is, on the planet, stop putting humans first. So it's kind of an enlightened anthropocentrism. The best you can do is an enlightened anthropocentrism. And I'm simply saying that our anthropocentrism might be accentuated by a consumerist capitalism. My friends in business school who work on researches that actually took place before laptop was invented tell me that these manufacturing companies were very interested in producing gadgets, and maybe true of iPhones, and gadgets that would develop an intimate relationship with the consumer, something that you will take to bed. Many single people take laptops to bed, and put it on their belly and sort of email and do those things of that sort. But so consumerism may have accentuated the anthropocentrism, but anthropocentrism is something we are almost trapped in. So even when you look at somebody like James Lovelock, who cares for human beings, what he can put forward as the most radical proposition, even when he says don't put humans first, he's actually saying it's in your interest not to put yourself first, so that you don't get into these sorts of problems. So I called it kind of an enlightened anthropocentrism. It's the best you can do, and that has a long history. So with now, I will now come to the last section, the concluding section of my, and I'll just read out the next 3 or 4 pages, and then we'll open up for discussion. And I'll try and edit even this so that in the interest of time. So for the first time in their history, humans are faced with the question of their being actors over 2 completely different scales of time. Scales that have been described respectively as human and inhuman. The structures we inhabit, regimes of probability that govern our everyday lives, the habits of thought that go with them, are all made for scales that are human. Some of these habits are probably even of evolutionary origins. I mean, this question comes up in the risk literature, like someone like Kaz Sunstein calls it a heuristic variable. Question as to why do people trust anecdotes more than expert opinions? So why do people say, it's been so cold, it can't be global warming? And there's an interesting, so that what Sunstein called heuristic variables could also be evolutionary. James Lovelock actually says it's possible that anecdotes help us to survive. and therefore we have grown to trust anecdotes more. Thinking anecdotally or trusting experience must have been crucial to human survival, that's what he says. Add to this problem of our evolved capacities, evolved habits, the problem of the calendar for global action that the scientists on the IPCC recommend. To avoid dangerous climate change, that is to keep the average warming below 2 degrees Celsius, we need to use up our remaining quota of carbon emissions, 500 gigatons, by 2040. That's what the 5th report of IPCC says. The calendar for concerted global action on climate change, short of anything like geoengineering, is a very finite calendar. That is, if you care, which is why the question comes, why 2 degrees? It's out of care. The battle for intrahuman justice, which is where one could locate the larger story of struggle against capital, is an infinitely open calendar. It's down to the day of Qiyamah that you could go on fighting for justice. Derrida is good on that. While some of our collective inability to act on the finite calendar of climate action is due, no doubt, to the self-interested work of those privileged individuals and corporations and institutions whose material interests are threatened by the action on the emission of greenhouse gases, some of it is also due to the problems of scale that the crisis involves. And this is where I said the gap opened up between cognition and action. In fact, the radically uncertain factor in the coming few decades is not the weather or climate. The most uncertain factor in the coming few decades in terms of a human understanding of this crisis are humans themselves. Because you can draw a chart showing how the climate will behave as the temperature goes up. You can't draw a chart showing how humans will behave as the climate becomes nastier, and when humans will behave. So we roughly know how climate will react, and we know in Jörg Friedrich's terms that the future is not what it used to be, but what we do not know is how humans will act in the coming few decades. Will we negotiate for a global calendar of concerted action? Will that fail? Will geoengineering emerge as a real option? Will that lead to conflicts or human stewardship of the planet? Will the struggle over the deadlock of capitalist mode of production become more acute than ever? Will there be a market-based workable solution to our climate trouble? We do not know, but what we know is that a new perspective on human history has emerged. Scientists speak of 9 planetary boundaries that humans, whatever their political choices, must not overstep. We debate the carrying capacity of the planet. We discuss population biology for humans. Or let me take the discussion back to where I started, to Zizek's formulation of the problem. And I'm quoting Zizek. So this is the argumentative Indian performance. Of course, Zizek writes, the natural parameters against our environment are independent of capitalism or socialism. He's quoting me. They harbor, the natural parameters, a potential threat to all of us, independently of economic development, political system, etc. However, the fact that their stability has been threatened by the dynamic of global capitalism nonetheless has a stronger implication than the one allowed by Chakrabarty. In a way, we have to admit the whole is contained by its part, that the fate of the whole hinges on what goes on in what was formerly one of its parts. So let us suppose that Zizek is right in his prescription for action. Win the battle against the capitalist mode of production, and the whole life on Earth will be secured again. But the more immediate fact of relevance to this debate is that even Zizek now has to do something that Marx never thought of doing. He has to build into the analytics of capital the story of something that has existed for a period much, much longer than the history of capital, and something that will, one can say this with complete assurance, survive the domination of capital, which is the story of life on Earth. Marx took it for granted. This is the sign of what I was calling an emerging planetary consciousness, which I locate in Zizek in the same way that he locates in me a faulty reading of Hegel's dialectic. So our action on climate change will be routed through all that divides us. We will legitimately fight on issues of immediate justice, whatever the implications of such conflicts for the calendar of global action on climate change. But one thing is sure, there will be no going back on the new perspective on the human condition that is now gradually becoming general. So whatever our political positions on climate change, it will increasingly be difficult to pursue them without being broadly aware of how the Earth system works, how the history of life on this planet has worked out, and where humans figure in it overall. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. We do have some time for questions and discussion. I guess let me start by asking you just to say a bit more about the economist arguments that you left out, I thought. And because the question you raise about radical uncertainty and uncertainty in relation to physical nature and uncertainty in relation to human nature is a very deep one, including in the Chicago Economics
Right,
Department.
sure, yeah. Well, I mean, briefly, what it seems to me like looking at the Stern report, what the economists go to is actually what I might broadly call the physics of climate change rather than the paleoclimatological evidence of climate change. So the physics of climate change creates it's not a linear model, but creates a model which broadly you can say that within certain confidence level, so much increase in greenhouse gas will warm the temperature by so much, and these might be its possible implications, right? The impact volumes will do that. The tipping point argument doesn't come out of modeling, it comes out of historical paleoclimatological. So it actually doesn't, as I was saying, the tipping points may be structurally such that you can't model for them because there might be a chaotic process involved and not just a probabilistic process involved. At least that's my impression from reading the literature. And therefore, the tipping point argument doesn't lend itself to calculation of risks. So it's not even the maximum security principle. You know, it's not even, you can't say, okay, the probability is low. You can't say the probability is low. And that's why James Hansen, you know, I quoted Wally Broker, but James Hansen, for instance, says, climate system is not lethargic. Again, a vitalist metaphor. But he's simply saying, you know, it can happen in 10,000 years, it can also happen in decades. So the historical evidence suggests that it can happen suddenly. And it's very hard to make policy against something that is not even covered by the maximum security principle of the risk literature. That's what I was saying. And therefore I was saying that therefore it's not accidental that the tipping point argument comes from much longer histories, which is paleoclimatological histories. Whereas the physics argument comes from, you know, most of the late 19th century experiments on to sort of Keeling temperature records and now satellite, you know, all kinds of observations. So that comes out of what seems more easily modeled in the report. I think someone, yeah. I think you can hear me fine, yeah.
I might not even be able to formulate into a question, and I think that's a lot of what you've presented, some quandaries that are very difficult to formulate into questions. It seems like as it's dawning on some of the insiders to the climate debate, the depth of the challenges of not only planetary justice, but the timescales that we're having to think on, that we're beginning to realize that we can't actually sort through the climate problem rationally. Like our probabilistic models aren't working. And then there's the problem of thinking ethically. We haven't really made much progress on thinking about our commitments to future generations and commitments to other species. Right. John Broome points out that you know, the way moral philosophy tends to work is the philosophers do this work thinking about the problem often centuries ahead of the solution, and we don't have that kind of ability with climate change. We have to think through how to deal with these problems morally in a very short time frame, and philosophers are just getting on it. Right. And so so what I see going on amongst people like Mike Hume and Andrew Revkin is that there's this collapse of a rational discourse into a sort of
The wicked problem definition.
it's the wicked problem,
definition.
and we just have to muddle through it, which might be the best we can do. We have to muddle through it, and we embrace local solutions and sort of learn to live with it. And I'm wondering if you can just address
No,
this
I mean,
muddle.
I think, okay, here's, I mean, Pratap's here and we've talked about it. One of the best books that I've found on the question of intergenerational ethics is Stephen Gardner's book, Perfect Moral Storm, right? That's, I think, the best exposition, and it's pessimistic. It is pessimistic. So there are two kinds of arguments. One kind of argument you get in, there's a book called This Dying Planet, in sustainability literature, but arguments that are drawing back on evolutionary biology. And I've found arguments that, comparing sort of humans to behavior of dendrites, saying that we are most sensitive to the approach of a danger if the signals of danger suddenly go up or down. If there's a sudden huge change. But if it's a slow incremental change, we don't respond to it. Now, if that's true evolutionarily of us, if that's kind of a universal proposition, let's say psychology experiment will bear out, then from that it follows that unless the danger is imminent and upon us, we probably won't act. Which sort of, in terms of humanity, it goes back to Benjamin's sort of history flashes up at a moment of danger, maybe at that moment. But the problem with climate crisis is that it's not like the nuclear Holocaust argument. So it's not a one event that happens, there's an emergency, we all come together. It's a cascade of things and very many things. So it seems more likely than not that we'll muddle through it, meaning that we'll pay for it in different ways. And at some point, maybe we'll come together. But this book by the Oxford, I don't know if he's an economist. Do you know him? Friedrich? Anyway, here's a book, this interesting book called The Future is Not What It Used to Be, where his argument is that another reason for inaction is that during this, what David Archer calls moderate phase of climate change, so kind of what the extreme weather events, apparently by their reckoning, is still moderate. And the argument is that the more richer countries have the wherewithal with which to pay the costs incurred by these moderate extreme weather events. So if the frequency goes up, so it goes back to the same argument that maybe as a species we are not equipped to actually react until the danger is imminent, right? So you can see what I'm trying to do. I'm not disavowing any of the arguments that Naomi Oreskes and people make about climate denial and self-interested climate denial. I'm saying, but there's a larger problem which goes beyond self-interest and goes beyond history of climate research. The change in the theory from global cooling theories to global warming theories. I think there is also we are actually, and that's where in wearing my more humanities hat, I had an argument about a kind of negative universal history or kind of a intimations of our being in this in different ways, all of us. So when I wrote, in my essay, I wrote, there's no lifeboats for the rich in the problem. And I gave examples from Californian and Australian bushfires. And Zizek makes fun of this, saying, yeah, true, there were class-conscious bushfires going on in California, but the thing is, really, Friedrich's terms, it becomes a cost argument. If you feel you can bear the cost of these events, then you will simply pay the cost, right? So it depends again on, that's where humans become the least certain of the factors involved.
One of the things I just want to say two things. So it seems to me that you described various kinds of temporality.
Mm-hmm.
And the question seemed to be how that for certain types of temporal spans, one can imaginatively take certain kinds of responsibility. But to care for temporal spans that go, then it becomes very difficult to think of agency, responsibility, and so on.
Right.
So just two issues here. So is the problem, contra Zizek, where he wants to put it all within the history of capital, which is clearly, a very superficial reading of the situation. But isn't it the problem that we've got to, it's not just the two spans of time, but how do we switch back and forth
Between the two
both
spans.
ethically? So it's more about one moment you have to be able to act in this particular medium of time. And at another moment, you've got to act in this medium of time, bearing at the same time the impossibility in a way of seeing what effectivity would be in that other longer period of time.
Right.
But you've got to move between the two, that somehow, at some
That's
point...
why I was calling it rifts.
Yes, but that's why I'm saying they're like rifts, but they're also like jazz riffs. Where you take it, where there's a particular moment, then you set off and you do something. So it's where you
They're also like Great Barrier Reefs.
No, reefs, isn't it? They're not like Great Barriers.
I'm just riffing.
You're
I'm just
riffing, I
on what
know.
you said.
So the question really is that intersection, that moment of, or what is that moment in and out, where you go between the temporalities. And just one other issue there, that in some ways, and I think you without quite saying, in some ways, the problem of religion, even in a traditional way, is the same sort of problem. There is God, there is this long thing, there's hell which will go on forever, there's heaven which will go on forever, and then there is a life to be lived. And people have been thinking this long time fate, if you like, and the short time fate in the same way, so that...
Well, the only difference is, first of all, two things, Homi, had you finished? Did I interrupt you?
I just wanted to
No,
say...
thanks, thanks.
How to bring these times,
Right.
together.
No, first of all, I should say, so my takeaway from all this, as a historian, what I'm saying is that, Dan's work, Joyce's work, I'm reading all these, Alison Bashford's work, I'm reading all these works as saying something has fundamentally changed about how we think of human society history today. How we solve the problem is that I'm coming to it, what we do. But I'm simply saying that even knowing that we have to do this to and fro, back and forth between these different things, climate change is, the popularization of the science of climate change produces a shift in the perspective from which we look at human history, both backwards and going forward. So Paul Ward's work, for instance, on calculating energy of old ships versus new ships and all of those things, which comes out of this crisis. So in a way, the question of scale has emerged, I think, and will emerge big time in the discipline of history. It will impact on English in another way, it will impact on anthropology in another way. So that's my first takeaway from the problem, without solving the actual problem, because it has to be solved by economists and all together. Going to your question, the where it's different from religion, and I think there's a similarity that you pointed out, and I think it's right. Where it's different from religion is that from the science, a certain kind of demand for action in the now emerges, which is precisely over which there's disagreement amongst economists as to how much do we invest now for future generations, which is disagreement technically about discounting rates, right? But my friend Dan Archer's, my colleague Dan Archer's book, where he claims that we have already changed the climate for 100,000 years. It begins not in a geologist's vein. It begins by addressing the audience, imagining them to be Western audience, invested in pride of Western civilization. So he says, imagine if the Greeks had found access to a cheap fuel and really lived it up, and we had to deal with the mess. Would you still think of classical Greece as the high point of Western civilization? Now, he thinks that that's how he's going to get us to think about 3,000 years hence. Now, then you up against the difficulty of what Stephen Gardner and others talks about, that it's very difficult to think about 3,000 years else. Secondly, it's a climate problem is a backloaded problem. We are suffering the results of not the emissions that we are producing, but emissions that have been produced in the past. So you come up then against the question of, can we do something in the now, thinking about 3,000 years hence? right? But 3,000 years hence in real historical time, whereas religion will say, can you do something now thinking about your welfare in the afterlife? So, and you do it individually, whereas here there's a demand for collective action. So what I'm saying is, while there is a similarity, so you're right in actually thinking that this problem as such is not a new problem, having to think on different scales of time at once, but what is difficult is actually that there are action propositions attached to that. Yeah, sure.
You're right. Of course, there is a difference. And there is a difference in the nature of the action. There's a difference in the quality of the action. Right. But I'm just trying to think of the formal problem. And I'm saying, but religious decisions or religious actions are also collective actions.
Yeah.
They're national actions. They involve money.
Right.
Whether it's in South India where you give them $2 million bits of your gold jewelry in order to, to ensure your place in heaven or in. So I'm saying, what fascinates me is analogical ways of thinking
and
about the long past as the long future.
No, they come into it. Yeah, no,
it's not that different because it also prescribes action, agencies, institutions.
And more than that, Homi, so Bruno Latour recently gave these Gifford lectures at the University of Edinburgh. And it's funny, I met with him sort of a few weeks ago. And because he had sent me these lectures, I thought I should read them before I see him. So I finally read them. And I said to him, when I was reading your lectures, I thought if someone was wanting to make a play out of this will lend itself to a very interesting play because even though he discusses Hume and naturalism and all that, what he builds up to with the Gaia argument is that we need a secular goddess. That's right. Right?
There is a dramatic aspect to it. He's got a theatre performance.
Now he's got a theatre performance. And he said to me, Dipesh, I've written this play. And it's, So, I know, we're also trying to see if we can bring it to Chicago. But again, the performative does not substitute for the other action that's also being prescribed. Yeah, sure.
Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank
really,
you.
Incredibly lucid and thought-provoking. I wanted to frame this in terms of how you framed it, which is in this disagreement with Zizek.
Right.
And considering that his commitment is to a kind of regenerated, well, somewhat regenerated form of Marxism.
Right.
I wanted to ask you in part because you're using the term rift, about the metabolic rift, about John Bellamy Foster and this notion, and whether or not you think that the usage of those parts of Book 3 of Das Kapital on modern agriculture and soil depletion and so forth, how you think of that whole debate?
No, actually the John Foster and his colleagues' book, The Metabolic Rift, that is actually one of the few Marxist writings on the subject that I've come across that actually take the geological argument quite seriously. And there is, of course, again, as I was saying, but then my problem with all that is with the solution part of it, to think that the solution is in a Marxist program of fighting against capitalism. So they kind of think of capitalism itself having created this problem, and the problem couldn't have existed. First of all, if Bill Rudiman and Earl Ellis's argument about Anthropocene having started 10,000 years ago, if that is right, then this argument doesn't stand its ground, though I'm more with them on the capitalism question. It's really sort of trying to fold all this back into the history of capital actually also means changing Marx's category of capital. And they should be upfront about it and acknowledge it, that this is a new analytic of capital that they're producing. Then where I'm with them is that exactly what I was saying, our perspective has changed. So now to think capital, you have to think parameters, you have to think all those large questions back into it. Secondly, and this I say in a lighthearted vein and not to insult anybody, but sometimes when I sit down with Marxist friends, once in Chicago I was giving, not this talk, but a talk related to climate change, and next to me was a colleague, a Marxologist colleague, and he had the Grundrisse, and he opened it at a certain point and said, look at this word, Dipesh, metabolism. It's there in Marx. And my friend Sheldon Pollock has he works on, he's an Indologist, works on Indian texts, and has this very interesting idea of the final text. And the final text comes from a proposition that you find in Indian literature about the Mahabharata, the big epic we have, which is also called the Bharata. And the land is also called Bharat. India is also called Bharat. And there's a saying which says that if it's not there in the Bharat, meaning the text, then it's not there in the Bharat, in the land. So a final text is the text that has already contained the entire future of humankind in that text. So I kind of think that, there's sometimes this final text kind of attitude that comes across. Yeah.
You've given a talk of great erudition.
Thank you. Now comes the hard part of the question.
Right, yes, definitely.
But I've already thanked you.
But let me place it in a very specific way.
Right.
You talk about planetary, but you don't talk about ecological.
Right.
And for me, the problem is that we're not thinking in terms of systems, and certainly not thinking in terms of ecological systems.
Right.
And so for me, all of your erudition is sort of beside the point. If we don't think ecologically, if we don't think systematically, if we don't think within systems, but only as individual actions, we get nowhere, or we make the situation worse.
Right. I mean, first of all, as I said, my own point was really, I would like to hear more about your point about ecology, and just to learn from how you're thinking, and not to criticize it, because to me, your propositions are not altogether obvious. So I'd like to hear more. But again, as I said, I'm a historian, and I kind of think, and I'm a humanistic historian. So I kind of think, I'm not competent to tell people how to solve this problem. There are people who are competent, who actually can, who either do the research or do ecological research, who can actually say, this is the way you have to go. As a historian, I kind of think what has happened in the emergence of what I was calling a new kind of thinking, a new kind of consciousness, I see that as having an impact already on some of the fundamental assumptions of my discipline. So when I first wrote my first essay, which was really saying, this is how it looks like we need to rethink history, human history. So my landing point is really this talk about a perspective on human history. And that may very well be beside the point that you were looking for. And that can always happen. But tell me a little more about your proposition about ecology and what you were saying. Yeah, sure.
I go to a lot of events around climate change and energy here,
right,
between Harvard and MIT for 30 years. And one of the things that I see most recently is people talking about geoengineering.
Yeah.
And when they talk about geoengineering, they're talking about single fixes, right?
No, I see what you mean.
Now, there's another stream of thought.
Yeah.
John Todd, Alan Savory,
right,
Tom Garreau, and there will be a book coming out soon, I believe, on geotherapy, where they're talking about ecological systems solutions rather than single-shot technological solutions. And the way that I phrase that is, I see people thinking like hammers, but I don't see people thinking like trees.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it's like they say, the thinking like a mountain.
Yes.
Yeah, it's in that spirit. And I take the spirit of the question. I know John Todd's work a little bit, but I don't know the others' work. So I'm open to what you're suggesting, open to reading more and learning more in that area. Just quickly, though, I didn't have time to go into the details of the papers, but on the geoengineering question, I already find the debate, the implicit debate between Mark Linus's God species type arguments and Clive Hamilton's book on geoengineering. I already find the area fascinating. But at the same time, I also fear, I'm now just expressing a personal opinion, that I can't honestly see a future in which we will not have some version of geoengineering.
Hi, my name is Kian Go. I'm a PhD candidate in urban studies and planning at MIT. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to hear you in person.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate and I see your idea to reframe this in various timescales and to complicate the matter in a bit. In terms of this issue of transcending capitalism and the issue of justice, arguably we still exist in this particular moment of global capitalist mode of production. And in order to get anywhere else, we have to transcend systemic modes, systemic structures of oppression and inequality that operate now. So even if we are thinking backwards and forwards in these broader, longer timescales, there are things that are happening at the moment which seem like we have to deal with. And if we don't take more seriously capital and what is happening at the moment, how do we do that?
Okay, I have no, as I said, I have nothing to argue against any movement that is aimed at securing more justice for the vulnerable, oppressed people, that is aimed against the inequalities of neoliberal growth. I have no argument against those propositions. My problem comes from two things. Again, the calendar that the IPCC produces, that we have for global action, however we do it, is a very finite calendar. It says by 2040. So their argument is that we have another 500 gigatons of carbon we can produce collectively. Whether we produce that by letting India and China industrialize and US becoming static, or how we do it is not there. They kind of do a black box thing. So they say you've got up to 2040 to do this by. And whereas it seems to me that by its own nature, the struggle against capitalism, if there was no climate problem, would have been an more open calendar, right? I mean, you wouldn't have said, like the Maoists said in India in the early 70s, that by 1975 India will be socialist, right? You wouldn't say that by 2040 capitalism will be gone. We don't know. So given that, I was not saying that we can avoid the questions of inequality. I think those questions will come. But I was trying to read even Zizek to say that when we fight those questions and fight other humans on these questions, somehow the perspective from which we will fight will have this additional element in it of our awareness of a much larger history. That's what I was saying.
Enlightened anthropocentrism, not putting humans first, is a very benign homily. But how do you do that? I mean, is it ever possible, or is it necessary to assign values to species in a hierarchical fashion? Or is it even conceivable that we can have a biotic egalitarianism?
How do you do that in practice? I don't know. I mean, you can refer to other things, like what was the Latin American country that a few years ago gave rights to ponds and rocks? I forget which country did that. Ecuador, right, yeah. But, let me come back to this, the proposition as such that Lovelock is saying. Government of India in the white paper on climate change, the government of India is always fond of quoting Gandhi, or actually misquoting Gandhi. So they begin this white paper by saying, let me read it out. Actually, they begin by saying, as Mahatma Gandhi said, there's always enough for everybody's need, but not enough for everybody's greed, or something like that. And the actual statement from Gandhi said, the earth has enough resources to meet people's needs, but will never have enough to satisfy people's greed. And actually the emphasis in Gandhi's writing is typically on the individual's sense of moral responsibility. So Gandhi, if you do a Gandhian reading of Lovelock, then Gandhi would probably claim that he had a lifestyle in which he tried not to put himself ahead of other species in terms of his consumption. How you do it collectively, I don't know, because I actually read Lovelock's sentence as you use the word anodyne or bromide, I forget what you, banal, something you had a negative adjective. I actually, to be generous to him, I called it an enlightened form of anthropocentrism still. Because his argument is that that the climate crisis will bring about these problems, and these problems have come about because we are laying these claims on the biosphere. So in effect, we have put ourselves first by saying human lives is valued, we have to value human lives, we have to support this level of population, make them prosperous, which will have even more claims on the biosphere. So he's saying that is the path of self-destruction. If we do that, then we are all collectively doomed, and therefore to back off. I mean, he's saying to back off from it, but he doesn't clarify how to back off from it. And my argument was that it's very hard to back off from it. So I actually go back to the argument of Peter Haff, the geologist from Duke I quoted, where he's actually saying, if you want to, however you want to make these people prosperous and survive, the 7 to 10 billion people, you will actually need more energy in future than less. And the problem with that is that when I read the energy literature, everybody says that even if we went completely renewable, energy will become more expensive. So actually the cost of that survival would be higher. But in terms of practical, I don't know how to do this.
So I did want to raise the question of the religious roots of anthropocentrism that you suggested.
Right.
So it seems to me that when people speak of totemistic religions, it's often there's this assumption that they consider themselves as part of nature, so sort of as equal members of the natural community. But the argument that I have against it is that as long as you cannot communicate with the other, you're always acting on the basis of some sort of empiricism. And
that's true.
And maybe the totemistic religions had a different form of empiricism than the ones that we do.
And also the fact is that your totem animals, they don't know that you actually have made totems out of them.
Right. And so, in that sense, we are not so different from them.
I was simply saying that, when you read the texts of the big religions of the world, including Hinduism. So, Tagore gave a lecture called the Hibbert Lectures in Oxford in 1930, called The Religion of Man. And what's fascinating about it, he actually acknowledges that there is a Hindu theology within which you can conceive of a God who doesn't give a damn about what happens to human beings. And then he says, but I have no use for that God. Right? I have to go to a God who makes my life special, who creates the epiphany of human living, and he sort of goes to Buddhism and all this. So, and ecologists often mention, passages from the Bible. So, and I have some passages from the Quran to show this. There's a discussion about why is Allah Rahman, why is Allah merciful? And the argument eventually becomes that Allah is merciful because he has stocked the world with provisions for us. So what Heidegger calls, the technology question, or looking at the world as this, what reserve was it? The English expression, standing reserve, as standing reserve, right? You see that more clearly in these axial religions, right? So I'm saying that once you claim a transcendental God, your relationship becomes special. Your place in the cosmology becomes special. Whereas, we don't have texts of totemistic religion. So we go by later colonial European reconstruction of it. Durkheim's, a lot of the book was actually dependent on Spencer and Gillen expedition, which was a colonial expedition into Australian sort of outback and into Aboriginal peoples. So then Durkheim is surmising from them. So, but he's theoretically saying, you imagine humans as this double, man and animal. Whereas I'm saying in the axial religions, the separation is much clearer. So, but the problem that we don't communicate with, at least most of the time, with other species, that remains. Whether
So in that sense, it's not the same as the colonialist problem in his relation with the Orientalist other.
No. The colonial problem I raised was with respect to this larger question: how, on what grounds do we claim the majority of the products of the biosphere? And the same question was asked by Europeans: on what ground do we claim most of this planet? Right? So I was saying there's a similarity between those questions. I was not saying they're identical questions. And maybe I work on colonialism, so it reminded me of that. It could have been a pure accidental reminiscence.
Hey, I was just wondering, so you've thought a lot about, it seems, these different timescapes and rifts and whatnot, and, divisions between people and lacks of information, and different ways that we can conceptualize problems of climate change. And also, how climate science becomes a climate crisis through the scientists themselves, right?
Through the caring
yeah, exactly. So then, but how do you think, we can really make sure that even anxieties about these problems are channeled effectively? Like, what about the problem of anxiety from knowing too much or realizing the extremity of problems and that creating inaction? So not the inaction being where you are or what your timescape is, but just knowing too much possibly, and how that could even make the problem worse.
The problem of action worse. Knowing too much about the problem doesn't make the problem worse, right? But makes our problem worse. It may, what could I say to somebody, who's paralyzed by having to face a problem? You'd need a better counselor than I would be. I don't have any answer to that question. I'm simply saying that what this science has done, its popularization, is changed our perspective on our own history. Whether that perspective immobilizes us or whether that perspective leads us to raise new questions about disciplines, about how we do history, how we do anthropology, that's an individual choice. But for more inspiring answers on those questions, you should listen to Bill McKibben, or an activist climate sort of knowledgeable person, or Jim Hansen, and you'll find lots of answers to that question.
Yes, but it's an individual question, it's also a collective question, and I think one answer to your question is that all the extraordinary knowledge that Professor Chakrabarty has accumulated on this subject has led to action, and he's deeply changing not only the discipline of history, but his millions of admirers around the world. And so, I think I can speak on behalf of Homi and me and say that we very much hope that you'll come back here and stay longer, talk to us more about this, and I also hope that we will have done a little bit more ourselves in this direction. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.